So let's get started with the fireside chat of today, the Carnegie tradition, looking back and looking forward. So we have 4 keynote speakers, Linda, Henrich, Arie, and Willie. Each one of them will have 5 minutes to present some remarks. And the instructions for this session were the following. So this is about looking back and looking forward. So the looking back is to highlight one idea of the Carnegie tradition. And the looking forward is to point out how current researchers could advance research on this given idea. After that, we will ask the keynote speakers of the other fireside chat if they have a quick thing to add, and then we will use the remaining time for Q&A. So with that said, let's get started. So let's follow the same order. I think we used alphabetical order by last name. So Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Felipe. It is wonderful to be here. Thanks to the organizers for putting this together. Arie, Lewin, and I organized the first winter conference in 1995. So it's especially satisfying to see how this has continued and grown. The first conference had only around 40 people. Arie, correct me if I'm wrong. I see some folks there. I see Rich Burton and Dwayne Hillowade. I know we're at that conference, besides Arie, of course, and maybe there are others of you. So email me. I wasn't able to look at all the pictures. So it's wonderful to see this institution going. I'm not sure I interpreted Felipe's question quite as he intended. So I think I'll come close, but I might get some points deducted for not nailing the questions exactly. I'm going to look back and forward in the Carnegie tradition by focusing on organizational learning. Looking back, I think there are 2 critical pieces. The Siren March, of course, 1967 book, where they talked about experience being encoded into routines which affect future behavior. The Lebanon March in 1988 was a tour de force of relevant literatures. It was much broader than the behavioral theory of the form. It focused on organizational learning, but it took in literatures other than those developed through the behavior theory of the form. And when I think about that piece, it's an incredibly rich piece. There's so much in it, but at a high level, 2 of the points I take away are vicarious learning, that organizations learn from the experience of other units, AKA knowledge transfer, and also that organizations sometimes learn the wrong thing, and superstitious learning would be an example of that. In the 1990s, research on organizational learning accelerated. We had Cohen and Levensaal's piece on absorptive capacity. Dennis and I published a paper documenting the variation in organizational learning rates, even in ones that you think might have had similar rates, such as multiple plants, part of the same firm. There was a very influential issue of organization science on organizational learning published in 91 and 92. That was edited by Michael Cohen and Lee Sproul, and had papers by and honor of James G. March. Jim did write a piece for the issue. Teresa Lance, piece in 92 on aspiration level adaptation. And then Steve Miner and Ann Mazias, Ann Miner and Steve Mazias wrote a piece in 96 in organization science titled Ugly Duckling No More, where they argued that organizational learning was now at the core rather than the periphery of organization theory. And as Steve is here today, he can tell us more about that. But one of the things I took away was they were crediting the development and use of quantitative empirical methods that a larger community were comfortable with contributing to that. So research aimed at understanding organizational learning aimed to advance theory about how and when organizations learned, aimed to be behavioral realistic, to include context, that context matters, and to take a more fine-grained examination of experience, looking at different types of experience, such as Jay Kim's work on failure experience, and other people have worked on different dimensions of experience. And there's been an outpouring of research on factors contributing to organizational learning that were theorized in INSEAD in March, such as attention, performance feedback, probabilistic search, routines, social comparison processes. Henrich and I edited a special issue of Organization Science on the behavioral theory of the firm on the occasion of its 40th anniversary. Willie, Dan, and Greve published a very nice piece on Neo-Carnegie, looking forward, looking backward, which I encourage everyone to look at. And then there was some work in that, while it was on the behavioral theory of the firm more broadly than just the organizational learning slice. The work on aspirations, I think, was most relevant for organizational learning. There's also been research on factors that were not developed in depth in the INSEAD in March book that contribute to organizational learning. And I put organizational structure here. I went back and forth on whether it belonged on the first slide or not. The INSEAD in March do talk about organizational structure, and indeed it, in part, responding to limits of cognitive processing of individuals. But what we're seeing now is looking at much more in-depth look with specific kinds of structures, specific kinds of governance mechanisms. We're also seeing work on social identity and learning from others, and really an outpouring of work on social networks. And just a little plug here, Sunki Lee, Jisoo Park, and I recently published an article in Management Science on organizational learning processes and outcomes. We were invited to do that on the occasion of the 65th anniversary of the journal. So I've learned from March, it's not good to predict the future. So I'll frame these as current and future directions. I think one theme I see happening now, and I think could benefit from more attention, is moving from treating organizations as unitary actors to acknowledging that they're composed of multiple individuals. So there are things in the behavioral theory of the firm, such as the idea of dominant coalitions, which acknowledges that organizations aren't unitary actors, but a lot of the empirical work treats them as unitary actors. But we're seeing more work on taking into account the multiple people that constitute organizations. I think transactive memory is a very powerful concept for linking individuals to the social unit. It's knowledge of expertise that then gets embedded in social structures as people consult those with appropriate expertise. I think there's room to look at how organizational learning theory relates to other theoretical perspectives. And the one that strikes me as especially promising is institutional theory. We talk about knowledge transfer. It doesn't necessarily improve performance, but often it's done with the goal of that and the function of other units, whereas institutional theory talks about the diffusion of practices and how that increases legitimacy and is a function of number of adopters. I think they're looking at similar concepts and really would benefit from further articulation. And Henrich had a piece recently where I given that site to some of our graduate students to look at thinking about that. Another thing I would like to see, and I think we see some hints of this, is a more unified treatment of when organizations learn well or poorly, and when they learn the right versus a wrong thing. I think what I see at least is there's sort of a community that talks about how bad our organizations are at learning and all the biases and mistakes, et cetera. And then there's another community that gives too much credit for organizations for their ability to learn. Whereas I think in the middle might be a more satisfying place to be in terms of characterizing what's really going on in organizations. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. And that was perfectly aligned with the topic. Yeah, so that was great. Thank you. So Henrich, now it's your turn.
All right.
Just
no,
a reminder, yeah, we have 5 minutes for the remarks.
Sure. No, again, thank you so much to the organizer for putting this together, very thought-provoking. I want to start with a small reservation or caution. The session is about the Carnegie School, which should require us to be a little bit fair to the various contributors to the school. Now, this is a school whose Nobel Prize wins are Herbert Simon and Oliver Williamson, so there's a fairly wide range of work being done. So it's hard to see how we can cover everything fairly. I have to admit, it's especially hard for me. I'm a student of Jim March, and I'm younger than the behavioral theory firm. But still, let's try. Now, the Carnegie School had diversity and integration as two central themes. It had theoretical innovation as a motive that drove things forward. And it was guided by an interest in one topic, the economic behavior of firms, including the decision-making going into it. In that respect, I think it's still fair to say that Sartre March's behavioral theory firm was a typical or classical Carnegie School output. The book was fleshing out the theory of the firm, making it more alive by making it behavioral. It was innovative enough that the field of management didn't really have the empirical tools to test the theoretical propositions in the book at the time. So the book had a period of gloriously languishing as a theoretical inspiration and component in a variety of later theory building exercises. But parts of it did become empirical at different times, often in contestation with other theories that were inspired by it. For example, Levitt and March redrew the boundary of the behavioral theory firm research effort to also include learning from the experience of others. So including the mimetic influences that institutional theory had started focusing on, partially inspired by Sartre and March. Now, the Carnegie School focus on examining the economic behavior of firms means that evidence on the process of imitation has different meaning depending on whether it is from an economically important behavior or a symbolic behavior decoupled from the organizational core. This is something that's not quite recognized, I think. Now, other parts of the theory became empirical without any such contestation. The research on performance feedback, risk-taking, probabilistic search is straight out of Sartre and March, and just got started much later because of advances in the empirical tools. This research has become a large research stream that's recognized as distinctly Carnegie School in objectives and implications. And there are many other parts that are either waiting to become strong empirically or they're already starting to grow. We need to, for example, there are Carnegie School predictions on issues like interorganizational politics, group decision-making, and those are distinctly different from, for example, the social psychological theory of group decision-making because they take the organizational context into consideration. There's already very promising work on this and other neglected topics that haven't yet made it to become recognizable research streams. But all of these things we can expect to grow quite a bit. Now, looking forward, there's actually an important lesson and part of a problem in this development. A theory on the economic behavior of the firm can easily fall between two chairs. Its focus on behavioral mechanisms differs from the emphasis on outcomes seen in the discipline of economics and the field of strategy. The focus of economic outcomes differs from the emphasis on mechanism that dominates the field of organization theory. So the Carnegie School actually occupies an intersection of two different dimensions, mechanism and outcome. And this is exactly a position that many scholars try not to occupy because it's narrower and more complicated than just taking one dimension all the way and ignoring the other. So are Carnegie School researchers being, can I say, overly boundedly rational in taking this position? Well, it depends on how important you think it is to make a behavioral theory of the firm. Maybe we don't need it. The beauty of economics is that the most important predictions are about aggregate outcomes, like things that happen in the market. So it's okay to be wrong many times over in predicting individual firm behaviors, as long as the mistakes cancel out nicely. On average, you're right. The beauty of strategy is that if you should happen to explain very little of the variation, people will still find the research important because there's variation in profits. And we're supposed to care about those. But scholars who have a liking, not just of any kind of organization, but specifically of firms, will be naturally inclined to understand them in as much detail as possible. That's the Carnegie worldview. Now, Carnegie is a school of thought, not a missionary church, however. So this is the kind of research that you should pursue if you think it's important, and only if you think it's important. Now, if you happen to be that kind of person, there are still so many nuggets of theory that can be worked out that there's a lot of things left to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrich, for those insightful remarks. So now it's Arie's turn, and I would like to remind everybody that you can post your questions using Poll Everywhere. So check the link that's available on the chat. Arie, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? I have a problem. I don't see myself. Could you go to the next speaker? I'll reboot my video.
Okay, no problem. So Willie, your turn, and then we go back to Arie.
Okay, Felipe, thank you so much, and thank you for all the organizers. I'm really happy to be part of this panel. It's interesting, at least comparing to the two speakers so far, how we define the Carnegie School in a very different way, right? Perhaps, Linda talked about the Neo-Carnegie paper, which Giovanni, Dan and I wrote, and there, when we're talking about the Carnegie School, we're talking about the original Carnegie School of Simon, March, and Sayre, which is actually a school of people that were working together, and Carnegie Institute of Technology, right? And it was a very interdisciplinary school, right? And they wrote 3 foundational books. And I think particularly the strategy scholars tend to focus on Sayre and March as the book, but in many ways, I think a more central book even is March and Simon. And in a way, I see it more of as a theory of organizations than a theory of the firm, of which part of it is, but certainly not the whole Carnegie School. I mean, Herbert Simon was a public administration person, and March was a political scientist, and it was Sayre was the economist, right? So we have to think about the juxtaposition of these 3, different perspectives, and also that they actually the 3 books have a lot of similarities, but they're also quite different. Of what I would, what I'm focusing on what the Carnegie School back in the 50s and early 60s was all about. Now, in the you can think about a commonality among the 3 about it's fundamentally about theories about decision making, and I think they all talk about decision making. But I will actually focus, not so surprisingly, on another aspect, and I will actually quote from the 2nd edition of the March and Simon book, which says, although the central construct is decision-making, much of the theory developed in the book is less a theory of choice than a theory of attention. Attention, yes. Decision makers do not attend to all their goals at once, nor all of their alternatives, nor all of the consequences of the alternatives. Particular goals are high on the agenda at particular times and off the agenda at other times, and attention may be restricted to alternatives known from the past experience or to few specific alternatives generated by product development or the same process. I could keep on reading, but in many ways, I do want to emphasize the attention aspect, obviously, for somewhat selfish reasons. But I think it's a bit on the back of all the perspectives. I mean, the performance feedback story is a story about attention to aspiration levels, sequential attention being the central part of it. In the case of Simon, administrative behavior, it's about how decision premises shape attention, focused by authority and identification. And in the case of March and Simon, it's really about the programmatic attention that's happening in the programs, what we would not call routines, but they would call it programs at a more kind of, operational level of the organization. And so thinking about how attention happens in all these different places is really a kind of, I see, to me, the central contribution that hangs what may be otherwise disparate pieces of together. And attention does relate to learning, as Linda talked about in her presentation. Now, looking forward, I think it was a relatively static model of attention. It was also, as Gavetti and Leventhal talked about, very backward looking, right? It's also not particularly strategic, I think, in that sense. I mean, the firms that they were talking about were like department stores, right? It was really looking at kind of small changes, the very much the local search experiences that's inside in March. But we have to think about kind of more strategically, more forward-looking, and certainly the exploration aspect is very much along that dimensions. But there are other aspects that are important for it that still could be assimilated even more into the Carnegie School perspective. Like a broader notion of cognition. Even I would say incorporating. Sort of a more kind of Wykean sense-making perspective, which I think March ended up embracing towards the end of his career. And the other thing is that specifically with respect to attention, something that I am personally interested, that I think it was very much kind of a control attention notion, right? Very much about how the organization, how the decision premises, how the programs of activities control attention. But now in this world of more dynamics and change, attention is more kind of also dynamic. And, rather than attentional control, we think about kind of a more social process of attention, what I would call kind of attentional engagement, of people within the organization come together and collectively in a social way are able to engage and create new opportunities for attend to kind of broader ways that they might have done at the time when in the 50s, the organizations that existed in the early 60s at that time. So that's all for me right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Willie, for those wonderful remarks. Arie, could you go now?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Just a little bit of history. Yes, it's true that Linda and I organized the first winter conference, and subsequently, the way I looked at it subsequent to that is I always saw it as the exploration arm of organization science. That's where we got together and really had exploring all kinds of new ideas. And to me, this is one of the things that really separated organization science from other journals. But just to remind you, organization science grew out of management science. I created a department in management science, it was called Organization Analysis, Performance and Design. And then one day I realized that I'm accounting for almost 22% of the volume pages of management science out of 14 departmental editors. And I said to myself, well, this is not going to last very long. Pretty soon it's politically untenable. So I proposed the spin-off of organization science out of management science. Of course, I did not know they're going to call it organization science. I had some other idea. But in tradition of informs, management science, marketing science, transportation science, strategy science, we had to have organization science. So we had organization science. And that was the beginning of studying organization science. And people said to me, where are you going to get manuscripts from? And the problem was in the first year, I had 360 submissions. And, I had one secretary and we were doing it manually. This was like, anyway, that was the beginning. Okay, so that's the looking backward part. One more piece of looking backwards, just about myself, and that is, I was a major in nuclear engineering at UCLA when I was introduced to computers and to the Jacob Marshak's Western Management Science seminar that he used to run at the business school. And so after I graduated and was my undergraduate, I told my professor in nuclear engineering, Professor Hicks, that I don't think I'm going to continue nuclear engineering. I'm much more interested in the problems of computers and optimization and operational research and stuff. And so I did my master's degree in operational research while my wife was getting her PhD in organic and molecular chemistry at UCLA. And when it came to do in those days, when you did a master's degree, you had to write a thesis. So I'm looking around, what am I going to do for a thesis? And my advisor at an engineering school disappeared in northern Brazil. So the only option was to go talk to Jacob Marshak, whom I got to know, and he handed me a little red book. It was called Organizations. It was not Mao Zedong's red book. And I read that and I proposed that I do a simulation of employee behavior, the decision to join, to leave, and the decision to produce, all in chapter 3, right? And after that, I said to my wife, well, maybe I should just study that subject. And I went back to Marshak and he said, I will only write one letter. And it turned out that this letter was to Carnegie Tech. And so I'm one of 12 students who entered Carnegie Tech in 1963. And then, of course, we studied the manuscript book. But, you know, we were brainwashed. This is exactly what Henrich talks about. It was an economic view. It is an attack on the classical economic theory of the firm to bring in all these concepts that have enriched our life ever since. But I have to say that I've not been close to the subject of organization for some time, because after my editorship of Organization Science, I became the editor of JIBS. God knows why they invited me, because I had absolutely no background in international business. But I did take basically a low-level journal, and in a matter of 7 years, it became one of the top journal in international business, and continues to this day. So I got distracted from organization theory, you might say. The only connection I had was my Organization Science Winter Conference every year. That was the one clue, one link. But then, when I stepped down from JIBS, Ann Sui, who started a society called the International Association for Chinese Management Research, she also had a journal called Management and Organization Review. And after 10 years, she wanted to step down, and they unanimously invited me to become the next editor of Management and Organization Review. It was, I have to say, it's been a great experience, but I had to spend time on the ground in China, mentoring advanced PhD students and junior faculty. But it reconnected me to Jim March, because Jim published the inaugural paper in Management and Organization Review on creeping parochialism. And I started talking to him, this is an interesting problem as to how even organization science is this problem. How is it that small clusters of scholars begin to coalesce around a particular journal or a particular part of a journal, and then they reinforce their orthodoxies and exclude other ideas from coming into the journal? And so I thought it was a very important idea. And I started exchanging with Jim when he started telling me about his interest in China, which is to do with ambiguity, how the Chinese were handling and coping with ambiguity, and how it fits with his ideas about ambiguity. So I've been a little bit away from really focusing on organizations. Fast forward. My latest venture has been to create a book series for what's called an Element series for Cambridge University Press, called Reinventing Capitalism. And when I started getting into that topic, I realized that in the behavioral theory firm, the original edition of the book, there was a chapter 9, by Ollie Williamson. This was a model of managerial behavior, which he said was, the frame was that managers are motivated to maximize their personal wealth while they are employed in a particular company. And the way they achieved that was to maximize control over discretionary resources, which we eventually came to call organization slack. And my early work in my career had a lot to do with organization slack. But it comes back, and I'm coming back now to a point that Henrich made, and that is that the behavioral field of firm is actually not very much in the field of strategy. We're not talking about how decisions are being made to impact financial outcomes, for example, or long-term survival of the firm. And I think that it's unfortunate that Oliver Williamson never developed this work himself. And this model, and people don't even know about it because subsequent editions of the book did not include these chapters, all these extra chapters that were in the volume. But the most important one is really Oliver Williamson's model. He himself did not develop it. I developed it a little bit, but basically, when this reinventing capitalism got me back to thinking about exactly this issue. What happens when CEOs and top management maximize personal wealth and they do things that actually affect the ability of the firm to invest in exploration? Because these strategies of reducing costs, stock buybacks, and all of these mergers, acquisition, all of these are designed to maximize the personal wealth of these managers. Then no resources are left over, not sufficient resources are left over to invest in innovation. And Bill Lazonek has spent his lifetime researching this issue and recently just published comparison cases of firms where he can show that in one case they are worried about the long-term survival of the firm and investing in innovation in the same industry, and the other one, how this concern with maximizing personal wealth basically detracts from investing in exploration. So my first point is that we somehow have to go back and find this model and bring it back into the BTOF to fill out one of the points that actually Henrich made about the relationship to strategy and to the larger issues that are going on. But it also relates, yeah.
Arie? Sorry, done. We're running out of time. So please, if you could wrap up.
I'm almost done. Okay. But I want to bring up one other point that we've neglected to deal with, and that is called the comparability rule. You know the famous adaptive equation in BTOF. Goal and time t is a function of the experience of the goal in time t minus 1 plus past experience with the goal plus a reference group. In fact, I would say that the selection of reference groups for to make the comparability rule work has been neglected by scholars of BTOF. Henrich, Silvia Massini, and I published a paper where we showed, when we looked at innovators versus imitators, and the selection of the reference group makes a big difference of whether you're going to be an innovator or an imitator in this regard. But it's not a developed subject. So my last point is, we need to also come back to the question of the reference group and fill in that theory much more. It's developed in old psychology, social psychology theory, but it's not a topic for scholars of BTOF. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arie, for those words of wisdom. And this is exactly what I love about the Org Science Winter Conference, yeah, that we can get these perspectives about where we have been and where we are going. So I could like to give the opportunity to the keynote speakers from yesterday, if they could like to add something. It has to be short though, yeah, just 1 minute remark from Dan, Steve, or Sur. Any one of you could like to add something?
Well, I just would say that talking about attention, it's interesting that attention has multiple meanings in different sciences, because in psychology it's a very mechanical thing. Jim March started by talking about attention as agenda setting, which is a major issue in political science. And Willie brings in this initial perspective and then moved to cognition. So I think I don't remember the attention that you mentioned in the book. I'd like to look at it and see what it is. and get to see if that's a kind of a stone that one can really enlarge the discussion as a major concept in decision making.
And
Thank you.
And to continue on Zer's comment, I think Willie alerted us clearly about premises being an important part of attention. And given how we've recently seen premises change in ways that maybe none of us could have believed, I'll give two quick examples. That, you know, Putin is a guy we can work with versus Putin is a fascist dictator. And, you know, we've seen the premise that he's a guy we could work with crumble in a way that, you know, would be most unexpected, even given the invasion of a neighboring country, not least because he's done it twice before. And the other one I would point to kind of in the other direction of less positive social change is the idea that, you know, experts can't be trusted to tell us about pandemics. So, you know, to me, I thought the issue of vaccines was settled, you know, with the smallpox vaccination in 1810. I guess I was wrong. So I guess if any of the speakers, in some ways, this also goes into Henrich's talk as well. Like, do we want to look inside the firm more deeply? If either of any of the keynotes had thoughts about how a theory of premise change or how people choose premises, which I think was Zer's question as well.
I think a great set of remarks. I will cede my time to the crowd. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. So we have a number of questions. One question that has been gaining a lot of attention here in the list is top one, is what concepts of the Carnegie tradition are changing in times of artificial intelligence and how? So do you have any thoughts about AI and Carnegie? And there must be connections because Carnegie is about making decisions and AI is about making decisions, but how can we move this forward? Any one of the keynote speakers has any thoughts about this?
I think that yesterday I heard one of the subjects that had to do with how to bring in the use of algorithms which is basically applications of AI to this idea of decision making. Now we have organizations that are algorithm that directing, you know, all kinds of things. And in fact, I wonder often, many times, how the management stay on top of these things. How do they know what these algorithms are actually doing that they've been allowing to mushroom? So I think that's the connection, you know, it's a very important connection.
So Arie gave the really important connection, but let me take a slightly less important, but one that's dear to our heart, I think. So the artificial intelligence is also a tool, and our tools for doing research keep getting better, and we keep being able to do more things that we hadn't done before. Very important part of behavioral theory firm is decision maker biases. Now they can be biased by all sorts of things, but one important and under-researched, not overlooked, but under-researched part is, what about rhetorics and conversations around them biasing their decision making? Now this is where one version of artificial intelligence, natural language processing, becomes this very powerful tool that anybody with interest in advancing Carnegie School ideas can actually start looking at those types of influences much more detail than we've done before, and there are leaps forward potentially in our research. I know this was a minor point. It's actually more important how firms are using it.
Can I claw some of my time back? I would say that I think just to build on the remarks, it's that, you know, Felipe, as you know, that, you know, AI has its beginnings in the Carnegie School. Okay, so Simon moves from thinking about these issues of human actors. He drags Ed Feigenbaum, and then they start thinking about, you know, knowledge engineering. But I think among the fascinating things is, right, that early effort is trying to codify the implicit knowledge expertise of the individual. You think about the arc of computer science and AI, you know, a bit later, the neural net effort starts up. And I think Simon wasn't too, you know, didn't resonate particularly, but the neural net's really interesting because that's distributed intelligence. And so we start off with the early AI is codifying our understanding of the heuristics, routine rules, and so on of individual actors. And there may be a little bit of architecture there. But sort of Carnegie seeds AI. AI in the form of neural net, I think, offers an interesting kind of model or kind of challenge in some of the issues that Linda was teasing up about kind of the interaction of nodes, right? Which wasn't sort of the starting point in the AI 1.0 Carnegie tech. So I think, so again, the Carnegie School gets sort of props for starting, but I think, how do we understand and engage with the distributed intelligence that the neural net effort and imagery suggests to us? And I think we certainly see efforts of that. And I think, it speaks very much to, Willie's interests, right? So, these issues of saliency and weights, and so it gets codified in a fairly stylized way in the neural net world. But one could imagine sort of a richer Willie-esque consideration of saliency weights in these, distributed systems. So I think there's kind of interesting arc where it, starts in our world, goes to AI. I think modern AI poses a kind of interesting alternative platform and challenges for our community to kind of create these, per kind of Linda and Willie's remarks, a kind of richer conceptions of these organizational processes.
Thank you, Dan. And I see Willie raising his hand. Willie.
Yes, I think about this in the context of bounded rationality and artificial intelligence being a way to expand the bounds of rationality behind what individuals can do, right? Or even groups of individuals groups of individuals within organizations can do. And I think that also expands the range of the possibilities. I was actually having a LinkedIn conversation about the AI with Nikolai Foss the other day. And I was actually thinking, we're talking about the rugged landscapes, Dan Leventhal, in a way how AI can search over all the rugged landscapes. At least that was my my imagery of artificial intelligence, things that the organizations can do. But what it lacks is something which is more perhaps in the exploration stage, or even in the slow learning aspects of it, which is the kind of the imagination and the aspect of, one of the critiques of rugged landscapes is that there is a pre-existing rugged landscape, right? But, there's a world that we're kind of inventing our own landscapes. And, that's kind of the part that maybe that's more the Don Quixote part of Jim March and the original Carnegie School, right? So thinking about that in terms of, not just the knowledge, and then artificial intelligence can learn from a lot faster than people, but also then expanding a new horizons. And then, that's something for the future, I believe.
Thank you. And I see Linda, and then after that, Sur.
So we are fortunate to have the author of a very interesting AOM Annals piece that relates to this topic here with us today. So I'm going to cede my time to him. Felipe?
Oh, well, thank you for the advertising. Yeah, but it's a paper that written with Tom Steinberger, we just published. We have the editor of the paper here, who was Linda, and it was a pleasure to write an article about all the connections between AI and organizations. I will post the link later. I don't want to use the time of the speakers. Thank you very much for the ad. And Sur?
Yes, I would say, first of all, that I don't like the concept of artificial intelligence. I think there's an oxymoron. How can something artificial be intelligent at the same time? Well, but it's just a name. And if we go back, I'd highly recommend that you go to a very heavy book, make sure it doesn't fall on your leg, by Human Problem Solving by Newell and Simon. And that goes back to Simon as a computer scientist. I read recently through parts of this book, but at the very end, it's very clear that Simon said that with all the computer science that he's written there, what he's really interested is in the way people solve problems. And intelligent, I think that was Jim March's perspective on it. So I'd highly recommend reading Felipe Anal's chapter to see, because I think this is probably one direction that the behavioral theory of the firm can move forward. I haven't seen many things. Felipe knows much more than me on that, but since the 1972 Noel and Simon, I don't think there was a heavy attempt to link it to, let's say, the behavioral theory of the firm or organizations and so on.
Thank you very much, sir. And Arie?
Actually, I would like to go back to a point that Steve Matthias made yesterday. And he mentioned, I think I heard him mention something about social movements. And I would say that we're in a time period where, in fact, we need to find a way to incorporate social movements into the behavioral theory of the firm. Because we are really in this is all new to me because I'm having started this thing on reinventing capitalism. But it's very clear that there are activities, there are movements going on that will reshape things, and they might actually reshape the way we expect organizations to conduct themselves. And somehow, and most of us in behavioral theory of the firm, we somehow never give credit to social movements. So and I think that's, he brought up a good point. And I think we should sort of find a way to bring in social movements beyond, let's say, from institutional theory. So anyway, that's just a comment I made from about yesterday. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arie. I think we have time for another question. So I will reframe a little bit the top question we have now so that it applies to all of the speakers. And it's about the connection between the Carnegie tradition and behavioral strategy. So how do these two areas connect? What are the similarities? What are the differences? Henrich talked about processes and outcomes, but what are other ways in which these two things interrelate? Henrich?
I mean, the processes and outcomes distinction is one, of course, that Jerry Davis has marketed quite clearly, and I think it's accurate. You certainly see it, but it's also a very broad distinction between the fields of organization theory and strategy. When you get into behavioral strategy, things get quite interesting because it is exactly trying to populate that particular intersection, which is why it's a field that has the interesting mix of doing something that is viewed as important by two fields, but also can be hard to understand by the same two fields. It's even more true for the field of behavioral science than it is for the Carnegie School overall, because it is possible to do Carnegie School research and not to worry about, for example, outcomes. That posture is certainly possible. In behavioral science, you have to combine them. I think it's a quite demanding and also a very valuable positioning of the field, and really compatible certainly with the behavioral theory of the firm thinking, as long as you keep in mind that there was an idea here that think about the economically consequential part of what the firm is doing.
Thank you. Willie?
Well, clearly, behavioral strategy is more interested in outcomes than perhaps other perspectives. But actually, I was the interest group chair of behavioral strategy a couple of years ago, and one of the things that I actually changed the mission statement because it was a little bit originally too narrow psychological, right? It was a behavior almost projecting at the individual level, kind of behavioral economics, behavioral decision theory version. I still think there's a lot of aspects of behavioral strategy that are a little bit more that way. I want to go back to one thing I said when it was my turn to speak. I mean, the Carnegie School is fundamentally a theory of organizations, whether we call them firms, organizations, or whatever. And that's I think that is, they do intersect. the organizational aspects of the firm aspect that go beyond kind of thinking of an organization as a unitary brain, right? I think is really important, whether it be through political coalitions or structure or all of the above. So I just want to make sure that we continue to reinforce that we are ultimately studying organizations are the ones making strategic decisions, even though they might be led by individual CEOs.
Thank you. Anything else? Any of the keynote speakers would like to add? If not, we have other questions. So let's move on. We have time for one last question. So the next one is about which ideas in the Carnegie tradition didn't age well. Any thoughts about that? Things we should be thinking about forgetting or changing? Yeah. That's a difficult question.
It's a difficult question to answer because those are the ones we've forgotten.
Well, yeah, we normally
Arie
talk
hasn't
about the
said
stuff that was
organizational slack.
underappreciated. I'm sorry, Linda, go ahead.
No, Dan, I was going to raise organizational slack. I think that has had a, I don't think it's received as much attention. And when I teach the material to the students, they don't find it all that satisfying, but maybe it's because I'm not a good teacher.
That's interesting. I was going to, sort of give a non-answer of some of Henrich is that we tend to talk about the stuff that was underappreciated. It's a really interesting challenge that's being kind of what, and then, and actually, Linda, your comment about Slack is really interesting, and argue that it's sort of we have these divergent, even early on, kind of theoretical implications about what it might mean. A different question, I guess, is just what was missing, and I think Arie talked about social movements. It's certainly the firm is not in a network. There's some amorphous thing called environment, maybe a demand environment or something. So it certainly was kind of it reflected its period in some sense of a kind of more isolated conception. But that's in some sense it's a implicit premise of a firm as a entity dealing with a somewhat stylized environment versus our kind of contemporary views of firms embedded in various kinds of organizations embedded in various kinds of structures. So it wasn't an explicit thing, but I think it was sort of, and I think Arie alluded to this already, it was sort of implicitly baked in a kind of, not a closed system, but not a fairly embedded system.
That was an interesting reframing for me, to think that maybe there weren't that many commission errors in the behavioral theory of the firm, but there were omission errors. So things that we should add today.
It's not about
Willie?
commission for errors. It's not about errors. It's about the fact that ideas come in over time, and then right now we're in a difficult time because I don't want to overemphasize this, but this issue of reinventing capitalism is questioning the way we think about organization, the way we incorporate society, and the way companies respond to these things. And we have to have better theories on how to think about this. And I think going back to behavioral theory of the firm is very helpful here.
Got it. Thank you. Willie?
I'm teaching an undergraduate class right now and talking about the changing nature of organizations. And one of the things that I think what I call the Barnard Simon March theories of motivation and participation, I think don't really kind of characterize, I think, the nature of work that is happening now in organizations, where there's a lot more emphasis on things like autonomy and self-determination and mastery, right? Different notion of the contribution of knowledge work, right? So that aspects of kind of modern day organizations are not quite reflected. I think that it's still very much either the bureaucratic model of the bureaucracy that Simon was talking about in a public administration, or kind of more of still kind of more mechanistic notion of organizations and their employees. And that I think doesn't age that well with respect to what's happening now in knowledge work within organizations.
Thank you very much. Sir?
In the old days in economics, they made assumptions about individuals and tried to aggregate it to firms. It didn't work. But in 1979, when Jim wrote, I think it was 79, a science article about Simon's Nobel Prize, he basically stated and said that Simon looked at individuals and organizations with the same models of decision making. He didn't make any distinction. And I think what Willie said about the behavioral decision theory on the one hand and social movement on the other, I think what one should try to do is really connect them rather than have them as two separate things. And I think maybe definitely in organizations, there are individuals, there are groups, and there are organizations, and it might be a useful direction to think about.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And with this, we get to the end of this very wonderful and intellectually stimulating session. So thank you so much to all the participants and the speakers. This was great.